Fame is a strange and seductive phantom. It promises everything: adoration, wealth, a life less ordinary. It puts your name in lights and your voice in the airwaves, making you a friend, a hero, a familiar face in a million strangers' homes. We invite these people into our lives, onto our screens, and into our hearts. We feel we know them. But what happens when the applause dies down? What happens when the studio lights are switched off, the stage is empty, and the person we thought we knew is left alone with the one thing fame can never erase? Themselves? There are stories of stars who fade away, who burn out, who are forgotten. But then there are stories that are so dark, so violent, and so utterly shocking that they don't just fade, they leave a permanent stain on history. A story that forces us to ask if we ever truly know the people we idolize. This is one of those stories. It's the story of a man who was once crowned the undisputed king of Western swing, a pioneer of television, a smiling, charismatic figure who defined an era of American optimism. His name was Spade Cooley, and his fall from grace wasn't just a fall. It was a plunge into the abyss, ending in a crime so brutal it remains one of the most terrifying events in Hollywood history. This is the murderous fall of Spade Cooley, from country star to convicted killer. To understand the meteoric rise of Spade Cooley, you have to understand the world that created him. Imagine America in the 1940s. The nation was emerging from the long, dark shadow of World War II. A wave of optimism, relief, and restless energy was sweeping the country, and nowhere was this more potent than in California. It was the promised land for countless families who had survived the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. California represented a fresh start, a place of sunshine and opportunity. They brought with them their culture, their resilience, and their music. And the soundtrack to this great migration was Western swing. Now, if you're thinking of simple three-chord country music, think again. Western swing was a breathtakingly complex and joyous hybrid. It was a musical melting pot, a wild, intoxicating cocktail of country fiddles, big band horns, swinging jazz rhythms, and even the sophisticated strings of a harp. It wasn't music for sitting and contemplating. It was music for dancing, for celebrating, for forgetting your troubles on a Saturday night. And at the very epicenter of this cultural explosion was a man with a fiddle, a charming grin, and an ambition as wide as the California sky. Donald Clyde Cooley was born in Grand, Oklahoma in 1910. His family were poor, and tragedy struck early when his father died, leaving his mother to raise him and his brother. From a young age, music was his escape and his passion. He learned the fiddle, and he was a prodigy. There was a fire in his playing, a virtuosity that set him apart. The family eventually joined the westward migration and settled in Modesto, California. It was there that the young Donald Cooley began to transform into the persona who would captivate a nation. He reportedly got his nickname, Spade, after a lucky winning streak in a poker game. The name stuck, and it had a certain ring to it. A bit of a showman, a bit of a gambler. It was perfect. By the early 1940s, Spade had made his way to Los Angeles. He was a jobbing musician playing in the bands of other more established Western stars. But Spade Cooley was never destined to be a sideman. He was a leader, a visionary, and he was hungry. His moment arrived in 1942. When the popular band leader Jimmy Wakely left his residency at the Venice Pier Ballroom to pursue a movie career, Spade saw his chance. He seized it. He took over the band, packed the stage with talented musicians, sometimes as many as 24 of them, and created a sound that was bigger, brassier, and more danceable than anything anyone had ever heard. The Spade Cooley Orchestra became the ticket in town. They were pulling in staggering crowds, sometimes over 8,000 people in a single night. The Venice Pier Ballroom became his kingdom. He was a master showman. Dressed in flamboyant Western attire, he would conduct his massive orchestra with his fiddle bow, a whirlwind of energy and charisma. He wasn't just playing music, he was orchestrating an event, a spectacle of pure joy. Then came the record that launched him into the stratosphere. In 1945, he recorded Shame on You. It was a sensation. The song, with its catchy lyrics and infectious beat, shot to #1 on the country charts and stayed there for an incredible 9 weeks. It crossed over to mainstream audiences and made Spade Cooley a household name across America. He was no longer just a California phenomenon. He was a national star. The success was dizzying. He was making what would be equivalent to millions of dollars today, buying up property and living the high life. He had truly arrived. And right there by his side, during this incredible ascent, was a woman named Ella Mae Evans. She was more than just his wife. She was a vital part of his story. Ella Mae was a singer and a musician in her own right. She had been with him before the fame, a partner in his ambition. They married in 1945, the same year Shame on You hit the charts, and together they seemed to embody the ultimate American dream. They had a beautiful home, 3 children, and a future that looked as bright and limitless as the California sun. As the 1940s bled into the 1950s, a new frontier opened up: television. And just as he had conquered the ballroom and the radio, Spade Cooley set his sights on this new medium. In 1949, KTLA, a local Los Angeles station, gave him his own show, The Hoffman Hayride. It was an instant runaway hit. Every Saturday night, families across Southern California would gather around their small black and white television sets to watch Spade and his all-star cast of musicians and performers. His show was a variety spectacle. It had music, comedy, and a sense of down-home charm that was irresistible. Spade was a natural. He was handsome, witty, and effortlessly commanded the screen. He became one of television's first superstars. He was no longer just a musician. He was a personality, a trusted friend, welcomed into living rooms week after week. To the public, Spade Cooley was the smiling king of Western swing, the perfect family man, the embodiment of post-war prosperity and happiness. But behind the friendly smile and the foot-stomping music, a profound darkness was beginning to fester. The kingdom he had built was resting on a foundation of paranoia, jealousy, and a terrifying capacity for cruelty that no one in his adoring audience could have ever imagined. The shiny veneer of Spade Cooley's life began to crack in the early 1950s. On the surface, he had everything, but underneath he was a man tormented by deep-seated insecurities. He was intensely possessive and pathologically jealous of his wife, Ella Mae. He controlled her life, dictating who she could see and what she could do. The music world was awash with rumors of infidelity, and Spade, who was reportedly a prolific philanderer himself, became consumed with the idea that Ella Mae was being unfaithful. One of the most persistent and damaging rumors, one that would haunt their marriage until its tragic end, was that Ella Mae was having an affair with the beloved singing cowboy, Roy Rogers. There has never been any credible evidence to support this claim, but in Spade's mind, the suspicion became an obsession, a poison that seeped into every corner of their lives. His paranoia was amplified by another devastating blow. In 1951, at the height of his fame, Spade Cooley suffered a major heart attack. The doctor's orders were strict. He had to slow down. He could no longer maintain the frenetic pace of performing, leading his massive orchestra with the same wild energy that had made him a star. For a man whose entire identity was built on being the magnetic center of attention, this was a crippling blow. He had to hand over the leadership of his television orchestra to his sidemen. He was still the face of the show, but he was no longer the undisputed king on stage. This loss of physical vitality coincided with a shift in the cultural landscape. The joyous, swinging sound of Western swing was beginning to sound old-fashioned. A new, rebellious sound was electrifying the youth of America, rock and roll. Stars like Elvis Presley were capturing the imagination of a new generation. Spade Cooley, the hero of the 1940s, was rapidly becoming a relic of a bygone era. His income plummeted. His fame, which had once seemed so secure, was slipping through his fingers. And as his professional world crumbled, his personal demons grew stronger. He drank heavily, and his drinking only fueled his paranoia and his violent temper. His abuse of LMA escalated from emotional and verbal to physical. He became a tyrant in his own home. There are chilling, rarely discussed stories from this period that paint a portrait of a man unraveling. One of the most disturbing accounts later shared by those close to the family was that Spade would force LMA to watch him engage in affairs with other women, a cruel act of psychological torture designed to humiliate and break her. He kept her financially dependent, making it nearly impossible for her to leave. She was trapped in a gilded cage with a monster. By the late 1950s, Ella May had had enough. She was living in constant fear. In 1961, she finally found the courage to tell Spade that she wanted a divorce. For a man like Spade Cooley, a man defined by control, this was the ultimate betrayal. Losing his wife, his family, and the carefully constructed image of the perfect life was something his fragile ego could not withstand. He convinced her to meet one last time to talk things over at their ranch home in Willow Springs, a remote area in the Mojave Desert. He promised they could work things out amicably. It was a lie. The date was April 3rd, 1961. What happened inside that house would be pieced together later through the testimony of the only other person present, a witness who would have to endure an unimaginable trauma. That witness was Spade and Ella May's 14-year-old daughter, Doreen. Doreen's account, later delivered in a hushed and terrified voice from the witness stand, is one of the most harrowing testimonies in the annals of American crime. She described how her father had been drinking all day. When Ella May arrived, he dragged her into the living room. The argument began immediately. He accused her again of having an affair with Roy Rogers and of sleeping with other men. When she denied it, he exploded. He began to beat her viciously. He punched her and slapped her until she fell to the floor. He kicked her repeatedly in the stomach and chest with his pointed cowboy boots. Doreen, frozen with terror, watched as her father, the man the world knew as a smiling TV star, methodically and brutally tortured her mother. At one point, he picked up a lit cigarette and pressed it against Ella May's skin, burning her. Doreen begged him to stop. She screamed, "Daddy, you're going to kill her!" But he was lost in a fog of rage. He sneered at his daughter, telling her to watch, forcing her to be a witness to his horrific crime. The beating went on for hours. He would pause, then start again. Finally, he picked Ella May up by her hair and slammed her head against the floor again and again. Then he stomped on her stomach with all his force. After that final brutal act, there was a terrible silence. Ella May Cooley was unconscious, dying on the floor of her own home. But even then, Spade Cooley's cruelty wasn't over. He turned his attention to his daughter. He calmly told her, "Now you're going to have to lie for me. You're going to tell them that your mother was in an accident, that she fell in the shower." He made her rehearse the story, threatening her, ensuring her silence. He waited for over an hour before he finally called for an ambulance. When the paramedics arrived, they found a bizarre scene. Spade was calm, almost nonchalant. He explained that his wife had slipped and fallen, but the paramedics were experienced. The scene didn't look like an accident. Ella Mae's body was covered in bruises, burns, and cuts. It was clear she had been savagely beaten. They rushed her to the hospital, but it was too late. Ella Mae Cooley, 38 years old, was pronounced dead on arrival. The official cause of death was a ruptured aorta caused by a violent blow to the abdomen. At first, Doreen stuck to the story her father had forced upon her, but the weight of what she had seen was too much for a 14-year-old to bear. Under gentle questioning from the authorities, the truth came pouring out. She recounted every horrific detail of her mother's final hours. Spade Cooley, the king of Western swing, was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The trial of Spade Cooley, which began in August 1961, was a media sensation. It was one of the first celebrity murder trials to be televised, a grim precursor to the kind of courtroom spectacles that would become commonplace decades later. The public was transfixed and horrified. How could the man who sang "Shame on You" and smiled from their TV screens be capable of such a monstrous act? The prosecution's case rested almost entirely on the testimony of one person, Doreen Cooley. The defense team knew their only hope was to destroy her credibility and assassinate the character of the victim, Ella Mae. In a strategy that seems shockingly misogynistic today, they portrayed Ella Mae as a promiscuous, unstable alcoholic who had driven Spade to a momentary, tragic crime of passion. They claimed he didn't intend to kill her, that he had simply snapped under the strain of her alleged infidelities. They brought up the rumors about Roy Rogers, trying to paint Spade as a heartbroken husband rather than a cold-blooded killer. But the prosecution had the quiet, devastating power of Doreen's testimony. For days, the 14-year-old girl sat on the witness stand, just feet away from her father, and recounted the horror of that night. Her voice barely a whisper, she described the beating, the burns, the stomping. She spoke of her mother's screams and her father's chilling calm. She told the court how he had forced her to watch, turning her into an unwilling accomplice to his brutality. The jurors were visibly moved. Her testimony was consistent, detailed, and undeniably powerful. It cut through all the noise and the legal maneuvering. It was the simple, terrible truth of a daughter who had watched her father murder her mother. The prosecution also presented the physical evidence. The autopsy report detailed the extensive injuries that could not have possibly come from a simple fall in the shower. They painted a picture, not of a crime of passion, but of a prolonged sadistic assault, a torture session that lasted for hours. After 26 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. They found Spade Cooley guilty of first-degree murder, the judge noting the unbelievable brutality and inhuman nature of the crime, sentenced him to life in prison. As he was led away in handcuffs, the man who was once the king of a musical empire was now just another convicted killer, his legacy forever stained by blood. The spotlight he had chased his entire life had finally illuminated the monster within, and the public looked away in horror. Spade Cooley was sent to the California Medical Facility at Vacaville, a state prison known for housing inmates with medical needs and psychiatric issues. The life of celebrity glamour was replaced by the stark reality of a prison cell. Yet, even in prison, the performer in Spade Cooley couldn't be entirely extinguished. He was, by all accounts, a model prisoner. He found solace once again in music. He formed a prison band with fellow inmates playing the old Western swing tunes that had once made him famous. He seemed to embrace his new humble reality, earning the respect of guards and prisoners alike. For nearly a decade, he served his time quietly. Behind the scenes, a movement for his parole began to gain traction. Friends, former bandmates, and even some influential figures in law enforcement argued that Cooley was a changed man. They pointed to his good behavior, his remorse, and his failing health. They argued that he had paid his debt to society and was no longer a threat. In 1969, the California State Adult Authority Board voted to grant him parole, scheduled for February of 1970. The decision was controversial, but it was approved by the then governor of California, a former actor who knew the world of Hollywood well, Ronald Reagan. Spade Cooley, at 59 years old, was just a few months away from freedom. The news of his impending release led to a surprising invitation. A local charity, the Alameda County Sheriff's Department, was hosting a benefit concert for law enforcement families in Oakland. They asked Spade if he would be willing to perform. It would be his first public performance since his arrest almost 9 years earlier. He was granted a special 72-hour pass from prison to play the show. On November 23, 1969, Spade Cooley walked onto a stage once more. He looked older, frailer. The flamboyant confidence was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. But when he picked up his fiddle, a spark of the old magic returned. He led the band through his classic hits, the same songs that had once filled the Venice Pier ballroom with thousands of dancing couples. The audience, a mixture of law enforcement officers and their families, was captivated. They weren't just watching a convicted killer, they were witnessing the ghost of a legend. They saw the musician, the artist, the man who had created a sound that defined an era. When he finished his set, the entire auditorium rose to its feet. The applause was deafening. It was a standing ovation, a moment of forgiveness and acceptance from the very community that was sworn to uphold the law he had so brutally broken. Overwhelmed with emotion, Spade Cooley walked off the stage and into the wings. He spoke to a reporter expressing his gratitude. "I've served my time," he said, "and I'm just grateful to be able to come up here and do this." Those were some of his last words. Just moments later, as the applause still echoed through the hall, Spade Cooley clutched his chest and collapsed. He had suffered a massive, fatal heart attack. The man who had lived his life for the roar of the crowd died just seconds after receiving it, one final time. He died on the cusp of a freedom he would never get to experience. The sheer tragic irony of his death is almost Shakespearean. It was a final dramatic curtain call to a life defined by dizzying heights and terrifying lows. So, what is the legacy of Spade Cooley? It is a story of profound and disturbing contradictions. How do we remember a man who was both a musical pioneer and a monstrous abuser? A man who brought joy to millions and inflicted unimaginable suffering on his own family. His music, once the vibrant soundtrack of an era, is now almost entirely overshadowed by his crime. Western swing itself faded from the mainstream, and Spade Cooley's name became a dark footnote rather than a celebrated chapter. You can't hear "Shame on You" without thinking of what he did. The art cannot be separated from the artist, and in this case, the artist's actions were so horrific they tainted his art forever. His story serves as one of Hollywood's most potent cautionary tales. It's a chilling reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a public smile, of the corrosive power of jealousy, and of the way fame and ego, when left unchecked, can curdle into a deadly poison. It was a story that shattered the innocent image of the celebrity family man long before the age of 24-hour news cycles and social media. Perhaps the most important figures in this story are the ones who are often forgotten: Ella May and Doreen Cooley. Ella May was not just a victim. She was a talented woman, a mother, a partner whose life and potential were brutally stolen from her. And Doreen, a child forced to bear witness to the unspeakable, showed a courage that is almost impossible to comprehend. Her testimony was not just an act of justice for her mother, It was an act of profound bravery that stands as the moral center of this tragic tale. In the end, the story of Spade Cooley is not a simple one of good versus evil. It's a deeply human tragedy about a man who had the world at his feet and threw it all away in a fit of rage and paranoia. It's about the fragility of the human psyche and the terrifying reality that the people we think we know might be strangers after all. It leaves us with a lingering, uncomfortable question. How much light does it take to cast such a very dark shadow? And that wraps up today's video. If this video resonated with you, please give it a like, leave a comment with your feedback, and subscribe to stay updated on upcoming videos. Appreciate you watching.